The date is September 12, 1968. An NVA sniper lies in the grass 200 meters from an American firebase in Quang Tri province. His name is Nguyen. He is 24 years old. He has been fighting for 6 years, 3 years against the French-trained ARVN forces, 3 years against the Americans. He has 47 confirmed kills. He is by any measure an expert. It is 11:30 at night, no moon, cloud cover blocking the starlight. The kind of darkness that Nguyen has used to his advantage for his entire career. The kind of darkness that belongs to the Vietnamese. This is the hour when the Americans are blind. This is when their helicopters are grounded, when their artillery observers cannot see to call fire, when their patrols stay inside their perimeters. This is when the NVA moves, when they resupply, when they infiltrate, when they attack. Nguyen has done this hundreds of times. Move in darkness, get close to American positions, wait for dawn, fire on the Americans when they emerge from their bunkers for morning routines, withdraw before the helicopters arrive. The pattern has worked since the Americans arrived in 1965. The darkness protects him. The Americans fear the darkness. Tonight he is hunting. He has positioned himself in the grass downwind from the firebase. He can smell the Americans. Cigarette smoke, coffee, the diesel fuel from their generators. He can hear them talking. He cannot see them and they cannot see him. This is how it has always been. Then something changes. There is movement inside the firebase. Nguyen watches. A shape appears at the perimeter. An American soldier, walking the wire. This is normal. American sentries walk their perimeters at night. They are visible against the firebase lights. Nguyen has killed sentries before, but not yet. It is too early. He will wait until closer to dawn. The American sentry stops. He is looking directly at Nguyen's position. Nguyen freezes. He has not moved. He has made no sound. There is no light source behind him. The American should not be able to see him. It is impossible. The darkness is absolute. The American raises his rifle. There is something mounted on top of it. A tube, larger than a normal rifle scope. The American aims in Nguyen's direction. Nguyen realizes with sudden cold clarity that the American is looking at him. Not near him. At him. In total darkness. From 200 meters away. He rolls left. A bullet impacts where his head was 3 seconds ago. He rolls again. Another bullet. Closer. The American is tracking him. In the dark. Nguyen abandons his rifle and runs. He makes it 30 meters before a burst of machine gun fire from a different position cuts across his path. He changes direction. Another burst. They are coordinating. Multiple American positions, all firing at a target they should not be able to see. Nguyen escapes. Barely. He reaches the tree line and disappears into the jungle. His rifle is lost, his position is compromised, and he has learned something that will appear in his report to his battalion commander the next day. The Americans can see in the dark. This is not a story about a sniper. It is a forensic examination of what happened when the United States military introduced technology that reversed 20 years of tactical assumptions about night combat in Vietnam. It is the story of how the North Vietnamese army and Viet Cong, who had owned the darkness since the French Indochina War, lost that advantage in less than 3 years. And it is the story of why NVA commanders, reading reports from snipers and infantry leaders across South Vietnam, were shocked to discover that the fundamental rule of guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, that darkness protects the insurgent, had been invalidated by a piece of American technology that weighed less than 6 pounds. To understand what shocked them, you need to understand what they lost, because the night had not been neutral ground. It had been North Vietnamese territory. And they had built their entire tactical system around that assumption. Part 1. The darkness that belonged to Vietnam. Let's be precise about what the night meant in Vietnam before 1968, because the assumption that darkness favored the Vietnamese was not propaganda. It was documented tactical reality based on 25 years of combat experience. The Viet Minh had used darkness as a tactical weapon against the French from 1946 to 1954. French forces, equipped with standard military optics and illumination that required line of sight, were effectively blind at night. French commanders learned quickly that night operations were catastrophically dangerous. Viet Minh forces would move at night, infiltrate French positions, attack at dawn, withdraw before French artillery and air support could respond. The pattern was so consistent that it became French doctrine. Do not conduct offensive operations at night. maintain defensive perimeters, use illumination rounds and searchlights to create kill zones, wait for daylight to maneuver. The Viet Minh learned the opposite lesson. Own the night, move supplies at night, position forces at night, control the initiative by controlling the darkness. By the time the French withdrew from Vietnam in 1954, this tactical principle was embedded in Vietnamese revolutionary warfare doctrine. When the Americans arrived in 1965, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong assumed the Americans would have the same limitations as the French: better equipment, more firepower, but blind at night. The initial American experience confirmed this assumption. American units in 1965 and 1966 conducted very few offensive night operations. The standard procedure was defensive: set up night defensive positions, establish perimeters, use trip flares and claymore mines, wait for dawn. The NVA and VC used the darkness the same way they had against the French. Night was when they moved, when they resupplied their units, when they evacuated their wounded, when they positioned forces for dawn attacks. American forces knew this was happening. They could hear it. Vietnamese voices in the darkness, movement in the jungle, but they could not see well enough to engage effectively. American illumination rounds helped. Artillery fired flares that would drift on parachutes and light up areas of jungle. But illumination had limitations. It created shadows, it alerted the enemy that they had been detected, and it required someone to see the target first before calling for illumination. If you could not see the enemy to begin with, you could not call for the flare that would let you see them. The result was a tactical stalemate that heavily favored the Vietnamese. American units could defend their positions at night, but they could not maneuver, they could not pursue, they could not prevent the enemy from using darkness to control the operational tempo. Here is a specific example that illustrates the problem. In October 1966, an American rifle company established a night defensive position in Binh Dinh province. The company commander could hear Vietnamese voices in the jungle approximately 300 meters from his perimeter. He could hear equipment being moved. He was certain an NVA unit was positioning for an attack. He requested illumination. Artillery fired flares over the suspected area. The light revealed nothing. Either the NVA had stopped moving when they heard the artillery, or they were positioned in dead ground where the shadows concealed them. The flares burned out. The sounds resumed. The company commander requested helicopter gunship support. The helicopters could not operate effectively at night without ground-based illumination to mark targets. The request was denied. He requested artillery fire on the suspected position. The request was approved. Artillery hit the area with high explosive rounds. The sounds stopped. At dawn, a patrol searched the impact area. No bodies, no blood trails, no equipment. The NVA had either moved before the artillery hit or had never been in the exact location the company commander estimated. The night had protected them. The Americans had fired blind and missed. This scenario repeated itself across South Vietnam hundreds of times. American forces hearing the enemy, knowing the enemy was close, unable to see well enough to engage effectively. The NVA and VC learned they could operate with relative impunity at night as long as they avoided American defensive perimeters and illuminated areas. But there was a technology in development that would change this equation completely. And when it arrived in Vietnam, it would reverse 25 years of tactical assumptions in less than 3 years. Part 2. The technology that broke the night. The AN/FVS-2 Starlight scope was not a weapon. It was a rifle-mounted sight that amplified available light. Starlight, moonlight, ambient light from distant sources. The scope used an image intensifier tube to multiply that light by tens of thousands of times and present a visible green image to the user. The technology was called passive night vision because it did not emit light. It did not require infrared illuminators that the enemy could detect. It used the light that was already present in the environment. Light that the human eye could not see, but that the image intensifier could amplify into a usable image. The first Starlight scopes arrived in Vietnam in late 1966. Initial deployment was limited. Fewer than 100 scopes distributed to select units for field testing. The feedback was immediate. The scopes worked. They allowed soldiers to see targets at ranges up to 400 meters in conditions that appeared to be total darkness to the unaided eye. By mid-1967, production had increased. Thousands of scopes were being shipped to Vietnam. By 1968, the scopes were standard issue to rifle companies. Not every soldier had one, but every platoon had at least one, usually mounted on an M14 rifle because the M14's 7.62mm round had better range and stopping power than the M16's 5.56mm round. The scope itself weighed 6 pounds. It was mounted on top of the rifle using a standard scope mount. It required batteries, 2 mercury batteries that lasted approximately 40 hours of operation. The image it produced was green monochrome, not high resolution by modern standards, but sufficient to identify human-sized targets at 200 to 300 meters in starlight conditions. The effective range of the scope depended on ambient light conditions. On a clear night with starlight, an experienced user could identify targets at 400 meters. On a cloudy night with no moon, the range dropped to 150 to 200 meters. The scope did not work in total darkness. It needed some ambient light to amplify. But in Vietnam, total darkness was rare. There was almost always enough ambient light for the scope to function. The tactical impact was immediate and profound. American units equipped with starlight scopes could conduct offensive operations at night. They could patrol, they could set ambushes in locations away from their defensive perimeters. They could identify and engage targets that were invisible to the unaided eye, and critically, they could do this without revealing their positions. The scope was passive, it emitted no light. An NVA soldier looking in the direction of an American with a starlight scope would see nothing. He would not know he was being observed until the shooting started. The North Vietnamese had no equivalent technology. They had no way to detect when they were being observed by starlight scopes. They had no counter-technology, and it took them months to fully understand what the Americans had deployed. Part 3. The reversal. Here is what the introduction of starlight scopes did to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong operations. The numbers are specific. The tactical changes are documented. The strategic impact was fundamental. In 1967, before widespread starlight scope deployment, American forces initiated approximately 30% of their contacts with NVA and VC forces. The other 70% were initiated by the Vietnamese, usually at dawn, usually from positions the Vietnamese had occupied during the night. By late 1968, after starlight scope deployment became standard, American forces were initiating over 60% of contacts. The Vietnamese were on the defensive. They were being ambushed at night in areas they had previously considered safe. They were taking casualties during movement that they had assumed was concealed by darkness. The pattern appears clearly in after-action reports from American units in 1968. Rifle companies equipped with starlight scopes were conducting night ambush patrols. They would position themselves along known Vietnamese infiltration routes, wait in darkness, observe Vietnamese forces moving through areas the Vietnamese believed were secure, engage at close range with devastating effect. Here is a specific engagement that illustrates the change. February 1968, Ashau Valley, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. The company had 2 starlight scopes. They positioned a squad-sized ambush along a trail known to be used by NVA forces for night resupply. At 11:45 p.m., the Marine with the starlight scope observed a column of approximately 40 NVA soldiers moving down the trail. They were carrying supplies, rice, ammunition, medical equipment. They were moving with the confidence of soldiers who believed they were concealed by darkness. The Marine squad waited until the column was fully in the kill zone, then opened fire. The NVA soldiers could not see where the fire was coming from. They returned fire blindly. Most of their shots went high or wide. The Marines, using the starlight scope to identify targets, fired with precision. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, 22 NVA soldiers were dead. The rest had fled, leaving their supplies. The Marine squad took no casualties. The after-action report specifically noted that the engagement would not have been possible without the starlight scope. The Marines would not have been able to identify targets in the darkness. They would not have been able to coordinate their fire. The NVA would have detected them before they could spring the ambush. This scenario repeated itself across Vietnam in 1968 and 1969. American units with starlight scopes conducting night ambushes, NVA and VC units taking casualties during movement they believed was concealed. The tactical advantage the Vietnamese had held for 25 years was gone. The North Vietnamese response was documented in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Initial reports described the American night vision capability with uncertainty. Some reports suggested the Americans were using infrared technology. Others speculated about radar. The reports consistently noted that American forces were engaging Vietnamese forces at night with accuracy that suggested the Americans could see in darkness. By mid-1968, the NVA High Command had confirmed through intelligence and captured equipment that the Americans were using passive light amplification devices. The NVA technical assessment concluded that the devices worked by amplifying starlight and moonlight. The assessment noted that the technology gave the Americans a significant advantage in night combat. The tactical directive that followed was clear: avoid movement during hours of darkness when starlight conditions are favorable to American optics. Increase movement during dawn and dusk when light conditions are changing rapidly and American optics are less effective. Increase use of heavy vegetation and terrain masking to break line of sight. This was a fundamental change to NVA operational procedures. For 25 years, darkness had been the time when Vietnamese forces moved safely. Now darkness was dangerous. The Americans could see. The Vietnamese could not. The advantage had reversed. Part 4. The system behind the technology. There is a question that needs to be asked. Why did the Americans have starlight scopes and the North Vietnamese did not? The answer reveals something about the institutional systems producing the technology. The AN/PVS-2 Starlight scope was developed by the United States Army Night Vision Laboratory at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Development began in the late 1950s as part of a broader program to give American forces night vision capability. The program was funded continuously through the early 1960s. By 1964, the technology was mature enough for field testing. The development timeline from initial research to field deployment was approximately 7 years. This was fast by the standards of military technology development. The reason it was fast was institutional priority. The United States military had identified night vision as a critical capability gap. Resources were allocated, research was funded, testing was conducted, production was scaled. The system moved from laboratory to battlefield in less than a decade. The North Vietnamese military did not have an equivalent research and development infrastructure. They relied on Soviet and Chinese equipment. Soviet night vision technology existed but was not widely available. The Soviets had their own passive night vision devices, but they were not providing them to North Vietnam in significant quantities. The Chinese had night vision technology, but it was less advanced than American or Soviet systems, and the Chinese were not providing it to North Vietnam in the late 1960s due to political tensions between the two countries. The result was that the North Vietnamese had no counter-technology. They could not match the American capability. They had to adapt their tactics to avoid the areas and times where American night vision gave the Americans an advantage. But here is the deeper institutional difference. When the Americans identified that starlight scopes were effective, the response was to produce more of them and distribute them more widely. Initial deployment in late 1966 was limited. By 1968, production had ramped up to the point where rifle companies were receiving multiple scopes. By 1969, the scopes were common enough that many rifle squads had at least one. The institutional system was responsive. The feedback loop from field testing to production scaling was fast. The timeline from limited deployment to widespread distribution was measured in months. The North Vietnamese institutional response to the American night vision capability was slower and more limited. The tactical directive to avoid night movement during starlight conditions was sound. But it was a defensive adaptation. It was accepting the loss of the night as operational space. It was ceding the initiative to the Americans during the hours when the Vietnamese had previously held the advantage. There were attempts to counter the American night vision advantage. NVA units began using heavy smoke during operations to reduce visibility. They increased use of tunnels and covered approaches that denied the Americans line of sight. They shifted more operations to dawn and dusk when changing light conditions made the starlight scopes less effective. These were tactical adjustments. They reduced the American advantage, but they did not eliminate it, and they came at a cost. Moving during dawn and dusk meant moving during hours when American helicopters could operate, when American artillery observers could see to adjust fire, when the full weight of American firepower could be brought to bear. The Vietnamese had traded one set of risks for another, and the trade favored the Americans. Part 5. The psychological impact. The tactical impact of Starlight scopes is documented in after-action reports and casualty statistics. The psychological impact is harder to quantify, but equally important. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had relied on the night as a sanctuary. The knowledge that the Americans could not see in darkness had given Vietnamese forces confidence to move, to position, to operate without constant fear of detection. When that assumption was invalidated, the psychological cost was significant. Interviews with NVA prisoners in 1968 and 1969 include repeated references to fear of American night operations. Prisoners described the experience of being ambushed at night by Americans who seemed to be able to see perfectly in conditions where the Vietnamese could see nothing. One prisoner, a platoon leader captured in Quang Nam province in April 1969, described an engagement where his platoon was moving at night along a trail they had used dozens of times. They received fire from an American position they had not detected. The fire was accurate. His platoon took casualties immediately. They could not see where the Americans were. They returned fire in the direction the shots came from, but could not identify targets. The prisoner stated that his soldiers believed the Americans had supernatural ability to see in darkness. This belief, irrational as it was, affected morale. Soldiers who had previously moved confidently at night were now hesitant. Units that had relied on darkness for protection were now experiencing darkness as a source of danger. The impact on NVA and VC operations was cumulative. Night ambushes disrupted supply movements. Casualties during night movement reduced the number of soldiers available for operations. The shift to dawn and dusk movement increased exposure to American firepower. The loss of control over the night meant the loss of control over the operational tempo. By 1969, American forces were conducting night operations routinely. Patrols, ambushes, raids. The Starlight scopes had made night operations feasible, and the NVA and VC could not prevent them. Part 6. The verdict. The introduction of Starlight scopes did not win the Vietnam War. The war was lost for other reasons. Political decisions, strategic failures, the inability to translate tactical success into strategic victory. But the Starlight scope changed the tactical environment in ways that shocked the North Vietnamese command. For 25 years, darkness had been a Vietnamese advantage. From the Viet Minh fighting the French to the NVA fighting the Americans, the night had been the time when Vietnamese forces moved freely. Positioned forces controlled the initiative. The assumption that the enemy could not see in darkness was foundational to Vietnamese tactical doctrine. The Americans reversed that assumption with technology. Not better training, not superior tactics. Technology, a 6-pound scope that amplified ambient light and allowed American soldiers to see targets that were invisible to the unaided eye. The North Vietnamese had no equivalent. They had no counter, and their institutional system could not produce or acquire the technology fast enough to matter. The result was a fundamental shift in who controlled the night. By late 1968, American forces were conducting offensive operations at night with confidence. Vietnamese forces were avoiding night movement when possible and accepting higher casualties when night movement was necessary. This is what systems look like when one has the technological base to produce solutions to tactical problems and the other does not. The Americans identified night vision as a capability gap, funded the research, developed the technology, fielded it, scaled production, distributed it widely. The timeline from identification to deployment was less than a decade. The North Vietnamese recognized the problem, issued tactical directives, adapted their operations, but they could not match the technology. They were dependent on Soviet and Chinese equipment that was not available in sufficient quantities or capability. The adaptation was defensive. The initiative remained with the Americans. The verdict is this. The North Vietnamese built a tactical system around the assumption that darkness protected them. That assumption was correct for 25 years. Then the Americans introduced a technology that invalidated the assumption, and the North Vietnamese system could not respond fast enough to regain the advantage. NVA snipers like Nguyen, who had spent years using darkness as their primary protection, were shocked when American sentries could see them at 200 meters in conditions that appeared to be total darkness. The shock was not just tactical, it was psychological. The one thing they had relied on, the one advantage that had been consistent since the French War, was gone. The Starlight scope did not make American soldiers braver or smarter or better trained. It made them able to see when the enemy could not. And in combat, the ability to see the enemy before the enemy sees you is often the only advantage that matters. If your father or grandfather served in Vietnam and used Starlight scopes, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit was he with? What did he tell you about night operations? The official histories record the technology specifications and deployment numbers. The stories in the comments section record what it felt like to see in the dark when the enemy could not. Those details matter. Write them down. They deserve to be preserved.